You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 358, the presidential election of 1789. Now, last week we discussed the implementation of the new federal government as the Confederation Congress faded out of existence. The states elected senators and representatives who would meet at the first Congress in New York in March of 1789. The other big election, of course, was that of a president, which was held in many cases separately from the congressional elections. The presidential elections of 1789 were nothing like elections today. For starters, no states chose their presidential electors the way almost all states do today. That is, the candidate with the most votes statewide gets all the electoral votes for that state. In fact, many states did not have an election at all. The Constitution left it up to each state to decide how to choose electors. Connecticut, New Jersey, South Carolina, and Georgia simply had the state legislature choose the electors for their states. In those states that did have elections, people did not vote for candidates. They voted for electors. These were men with well-known political views who would independently make a decision as to whom they would select as president and vice president. Most electors publicly pledged to vote for a particular candidate. Some states elected a slate of electors statewide. Others opted to let each congressional district vote for one elector. Those states that got their act together in time held their elections on January 7th, 1789, as had been directed by the Confederation Congress 4 months earlier. Now, we don't even have complete records of the popular vote, but turnout does seem to have been surprisingly low. Some newspapers report turnout of between 20% and 50% of eligible voters, and of course voter eligibility was much more difficult to obtain back then. Across 6 states that held popular votes, there appeared to have been less than 30,000 total votes cast for electors. Part of this also may have been that it was the middle of January in a brutal winter, and most people couldn't either walk or ride a horse the several miles to get to a polling station, at least not easily. North Carolina and Rhode Island, which had not yet ratified the Constitution, did not participate in the elections. New York had ratified, but they never passed a state law that would specify how the electors would be chosen. The Anti-Federalist majority in the General Assembly voted for one method, and the Federalist majority in the Senate voted for a different method. The result was a deadlock, with neither side willing to compromise. This deadlock remained until after the Electoral College met and selected a president, meaning that New York simply did not put forward any electors that would participate in the election. For the 10 states that chose electors, those electors met in each of the state capitals to cast their votes. The states had elected a total of 73 electors, but 2 votes in Maryland and 2 votes in Virginia were never cast. In Virginia, one of the districts simply failed to turn in their results. Another delegate in Virginia, Warner Lewis, simply failed to show up to vote. In Maryland, 2 of the delegates, George Platter and William Richardson, were present for the electoral vote but did not cast their votes. Now, there was no nomination process for the presidency, no primaries, nor were there even any candidates who ran for election. Running would have been considered unseemly. Americans would have been skeptical of anyone who personally campaigned for office. They didn't want someone who wanted power for themselves. Besides, everyone knew who the first president would be. At the Constitutional Convention and at all the various ratifying conventions, pretty much everyone assumed that George Washington would fill that role. In addition to being the man who won the Revolutionary War, Washington had earned national respect by retiring at the end of the war. This proved he was not a man who grasped for more power. Rather, he simply did his duty for his country and then retired to his plantation. This convinced voters that Washington would not use the presidency as a stepping stone to becoming king. That remained a real fear in America at this time. Perhaps the only other person with a good positive name recognition nationwide was Benjamin Franklin. Although Franklin served as Pennsylvania's president until November of 1788, he was too old and infirm for any service in the new government. He had been carried to the Constitutional Convention meetings in 1787, and even at that time was often too weak to give speeches. Following the convention, Franklin was rarely seen in public. He mostly remained in his sickbed, so he was in no condition to be considered for any new office, let alone president. Most of the other possible contenders for the office were regional favorites. John Adams was popular in New England, but not so much elsewhere. Other candidates might be popular within their states, but no one really had Washington's national appeal. In the end, Washington received the unanimous election of every elector who cast a vote, a total of 69 votes. The vice presidential election was another story. Now, there was no nationwide figure to take on that role, but John Adams was the odds-on favorite. Adams had been an important leader in the Continental Congress and had been a key negotiator of the peace treaty that ended the war. He had remained in Europe after the war and was serving as America's first ambassador to Britain. Adams only returned to America in the summer of 1788, after Massachusetts had already ratified the Constitution. He returned to his farm and to his life as a private citizen. He did not campaign for any office and did not advocate for himself, but that said, he did not discourage others from putting him forward as a candidate. Adams seemed like a good choice to many. In addition to his credentials and experience, Adams was from New England, which provided some regional balance to Washington as a Southern candidate. Adams also seemed to be in line with Washington's views. Both men generally believed in the new Constitution and supported a stronger federal government. As a result, Adams quickly became the consensus candidate for vice president. This raised concerns, though. Under the Constitution, each elector would cast 2 votes. Based on the final results, the recipient of the most votes became president. The second-place finisher would become vice president. There was no way for electors to specify that they were casting one vote for president and the other for vice president. Some insiders feared that politicians might use this process to bypass Washington. Alexander Hamilton very much wanted Washington to become the first president. He began writing to others that if pretty much all the electors voted for Washington and Adams, that just a small handful of electors might withhold their votes for Washington and allow Adams to get the most votes, thus becoming president. Adams wrote about his concerns to several other leaders around the country. He noted that the Adams faction in New England had often allied itself with the Lee faction in Virginia to win various political battles in Congress. In fact, these factions had teamed up once before against George Washington in the Conway Cabal, which was the effort in 1777 to replace Washington with Horatio Gates as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. There was no actual basis for such a conspiracy to snatch the presidency from Washington, but that didn't get in the way of Hamilton's paranoia. Hamilton did not really have any political disagreements with Adams. The two men generally found themselves on the same sides of most policy matters, but Hamilton still feared that politics might somehow get in the way of electing Washington. So Hamilton reached out to 7 or 8 electors in Connecticut, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, asking them to vote for someone other than Adams on their second vote. This, he thought, would be enough to ensure that Washington would receive more votes and become president. As it turned out, Hamilton had nothing to worry about. While the electors voted unanimously for Washington, they showed no such unanimity for their second votes. The Connecticut electors that Hamilton had contacted voted for Samuel Huntington, who was governor of Connecticut. 2 Pennsylvania delegates voted for John Hancock, who was governor of Massachusetts. The New Jersey delegates only gave 1 vote to Adams and 5 to John Jay of New York, so more than Hamilton even contacted voted against Adams. And other electors across the continent gave various votes to others, casting votes for a total of 11 different candidates for their second vote. The result was that Adams only received 34 votes. This is 1 vote shy of a majority. Even though he received nearly 4 times the vote of the next highest candidate, Adams felt humiliated by his poor showing. He called it a stain on his character and even considered declining the office. At the time, he didn't know about the political scheming behind the vote. When he later found out about Hamilton's role in all of this, it created a rupture between the 2 men, which never really healed. And despite his private disappointment, Adams retained his cheerful public demeanor and accepted his election as vice president. He also congratulated George Washington on his victory and praised the president's talents. According to the schedule created by the Confederation Congress, the elections were supposed to take place in January, the electors would vote in early February, and Congress would convene for the first time on March 4th. One of their first official acts would be to confirm the Electoral College vote and notify the new president and vice president. When the newly elected members of Congress assembled at Federal Hall on the morning of March 4th, they discovered they were pretty lonely. Only 8 out of 22 senators were present, and only 13 out of 59 representatives had made it to New York. All but 2 of those present were from just 3 states, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. None of the New York delegation was present because the state had held late elections and still didn't even have the results of those elections. Several other elections were still being challenged in courts. In other cases, members either hadn't bothered to leave on time or had travel problems that delayed their arrival. Without a quorum to do business, Congress could do nothing. The members who had arrived simply hung around the city waiting for more of their colleagues to show up. 10 days later, on March 14th, James Madison finally arrived in town. He noted by that time that only 2 other congressmen and no additional senators had arrived. Madison wrote to Washington that nothing could be done, and they couldn't even count the votes for president. Massachusetts Representative Fisher Ames called the situation mortifying and wondered if, quote, the public will forget the government before it is born. The Secretary of Congress, still holding that position from the Confederation Congress, Charles Thompson, began writing to absent senators and representatives, begging them to come. He wrote to Senator George Reed of Delaware, quote, as a friend, I entreat you to lay aside all lesser concerns and private business and come on immediately. Those who feel for the honor and are solicitous for the happiness of this country are pained to the heart, while those who are averse to the new Constitution and those who are unfriendly to the liberty and consequently to the happiness and prosperity of this country exult in our languor. Thompson was pretty much running the government on his own until the new Congress could reach a quorum. John Jay, who had been appointed Secretary for Foreign Affairs in the Confederation Congress, was still kind of keeping an eye on foreign policy issues. Henry Knox, another Confederation holdover, was still managing the military. Of course, the military only consisted of a few hundred soldiers who were occupying a few forts. The French minister to the U.S., the Comte de Moustier, wrote back to officials in Paris that, quote, Congress, like their predecessors, suffer from the general indifference toward public service when it comes to actually doing their part. The absence of a quorum for weeks proved this point. He believed that the new country could not survive without foreign protection, and that if France did not provide it, Britain was going to find a way to take back control of its former colonies. The members who did arrive could not conduct official business, but they could hang out in taverns and begin discussing things informally. Rather than talk about pressing issues like creating a judiciary or establishing a new system of tariffs, they mostly fought over where they should move the seat of government. The Pennsylvania delegation, which was one of the few states that showed up on time, had a plan to call for an adjournment as soon as the presidential elections were counted, and then move the Congress to Philadelphia. After 4 long weeks, the House finally got its quorum on April 1st. 29 of the 55 representatives were present, so just over half the body. Meeting in chambers that were still under construction, they elected Frederick Muhlenberg of Pennsylvania as their speaker and began organizing the House rules and committees. It would take another week until April 6th before enough senators arrived, giving that body a quorum. At that point, Congress could finally count the electoral votes and proclaim George Washington to be the first president and John Adams vice president. Now, everyone had known for weeks how the elections were going to turn out, but until the official count by Congress, there was nothing official. George Washington remained home at Mount Vernon. He did not want to appear eager or desirous of the presidency. In fact, there is good reason to believe that he was not simply showing false modesty. Washington really wanted to remain retired from public life. In the elections, Washington said nothing to encourage others, and several times angrily silenced people who discussed the elections in his presence. On April 1st, a month after the Electoral College should have met, Washington wrote to Henry Knox expressing his relief at the delay. Quote, "I feel for those members of the new Congress who hitherto have given an unavailing attendance at the theater of business. For myself, the delay may be compared to a reprieve, for in confidence I can assure you, with the world it would obtain little credit, that my movements to the chair of government will be accompanied with feelings not unlike those of a culprit who is going to the place of his execution. So unwilling am I, in the evening of a life nearly consumed in public cares, to quit a peaceful abode for an ocean of difficulties without that competency of political skill, abilities, and inclination which is necessary to manage the helm." Leaders like Hamilton and Madison, and even Lafayette from France, had written letters to Washington imploring him to accept the presidency, fearing the government would fail without him, and that with that failure the entire United States as a concept were at stake. Comments like those of the Comte de Moustier made clear that Europeans were ready to pounce if the new government proved ineffective. So Washington resigned himself to the idea that he would serve as president for at least a few years to get the new government going. In late March, he wrote to Madison in New York, asking him to find appropriate accommodations. He asked for a small home or apartment where he could avoid having a larger mansion, which would obligate him to hold large receptions for guests in his home. He also believed a smaller residence would help to reduce criticism of him effectively taking on the role of a king. Publicly, however, Washington took no steps to assume that he won the election. He simply remained at home, continuing on with his regular life. After Congress confirmed the electoral vote on April 6th, they dispatched Secretary Charles Thompson to ride to Virginia and inform Washington. The trip to Mount Vernon took a week. On April 14th, Thompson met with Washington to inform him of his election. Washington had prepared for the moment by writing out his response, which he read to Thompson and then sent back to Congress. "Sir, I have been long accustomed to entertain so great a respect for the opinion of my fellow citizens that the knowledge of their unanimous suffrages having been given in my favor scarcely leaves me an alternative for an option. Whatever may have been my private feelings and sentiments, I believe I cannot give a greater evidence of my sensibility for the honor they have done me than by accepting the appointment. I am so much affected by this fresh proof of my country's esteem and confidence that silence can best explain my gratitude. While I realize the arduous nature of the task which is conferred on me and feel my inability to perform it, I wish there may not be a reason for regretting the choice. All I can promise is that which can be accomplished by an honest zeal." Washington also informed them that he would leave for New York within 2 days. Washington had already prepared for his trip. The reason for a delay was that he rode to Fredericksburg to visit his mother, who was dying of breast cancer. He spent the night at his mother's house before returning to Mount Vernon the following day. Short on cash, Washington had to borrow money for his trip to New York. Charles Thompson accompanied the president, along with his aide David Humphreys and his secretary Tobias Lear, as well as his personal servant Billy Lee. Martha did not go with him. She would join him a month later. She doesn't seem to have been happy at Washington's new role. Days after he left, she wrote to her nephew saying, quote, "I am truly sorry to tell that the general is gone to New York. Mr. Charles Thompson came to express to him on the 14th. When or whether he will come home again, God only knows. I think it was much too late for him to go into public life again, but it was not to be avoided." Washington hoped to avoid the pomp of appearing as a new king on his way to New York. He often tried to leave towns early in order to avoid parades and tried to downplay all the celebrations, but he had no luck with this. The people really wanted to celebrate this grand event. Each city celebrated Washington as he passed through towns on his way to New York. Celebrations honored the new president. Parades, bells, military escorts, and musket fire celebrated the new leader. In Trenton, 13 young maidens threw flower petals at his feet while singing "Welcome, Mighty Chief." In Philadelphia, they placed a laurel wreath on his head, as had been done for Roman emperors. He may not have wanted to appear as a king, but the people did seem to want to honor him like a king. The group finally arrived in Elizabethtown, New Jersey on April 23rd, where a committee of elected leaders met him, along with an honor guard, to carry him aboard a large barge across the Hudson River to his welcome celebration in New York. With the new president having arrived in the capital, the new government could finally get to work. Next week, the new government gets to work. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show on the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mullern, and Mitchell Anderson. And thanks to Robert Morris Circle supporters Patrick LeBeau and Kurt Avard. I also want to thank Carl Oberg, Dave Meyer, and Jed Bryan for one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. I know I say it a lot, but I really do appreciate everyone who supports this podcast through a subscription on Patreon or one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. If you can give as little as $2 a month, you can get access to all the episodes commercial-free on Patreon. If you can support at the $10 level, you'll get a magnet each month with a different flag from the Revolution. Your financial support really is critical to allowing me to continue this podcast, so I really do appreciate everyone who chips in to help keep this thing going. Now, this week we covered the first presidential elections. Like the congressional elections that we covered last week, the elections were very different from the way we hold elections today. Although we still use the Electoral College, voters today usually have no idea of the names of the electors that they are choosing. We only know the name of the candidate that they have pledged to elect. We also take for granted that a president will be selected by the popular vote, or at least pretty close to it, given the small distortions that the Electoral College creates. But there is no requirement under the Constitution that electors be selected by the popular vote. The Constitution just says each state may choose its electors as the states see fit. Most states move to popular votes within a few elections after the first one. South Carolina was a real holdout. It did not hold popular elections for president until after the Civil War in 1868. We also see a great many states that do have popular votes in this first election, allowing their electors to be divided up based on the wishes of the voters. Over time, states realized that their state voting power and influence was more effective if a winning candidate received 100% of the state's electors. Only 2 states today, Maine and Nebraska, still carry on the tradition of letting House districts select at least one elector who may be different from the statewide vote. The only real constitutional change regarding presidential elections was the 12th Amendment. The 1800 election was thrown into the House of Representatives and went through dozens of ballots without a winner. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr were on the Democratic-Republican ticket. Electors gave their 2 votes to both men. As a result, they were tied. It finally came down to the efforts of Alexander Hamilton, who hated Burr more than he hated Jefferson, to convince Federalist representatives to give that election to Jefferson. After that mess, the 12th Amendment allowed electors to cast 1 vote for president and designate their second vote as their pick for vice president. One trivia question I like to ask history experts is what president received the fewest electoral votes? Most people will guess John Adams, since only a few states were added when he won office. But unlike Washington, who was elected unanimously both times, Adams won a narrow majority of electoral votes. But the answer is Washington. The first president got all 69 electoral votes from the 10 states that participated in this first election. When Adams ran in 1796, he won by 71 electoral votes to 68. There were, by that time, 16 states participating, and many states got more electors after the 1790 census. One other huge change between presidential elections in 1789 and today is the idea of the candidate campaigning for office. As I said in the main show, Washington did not campaign for office at all. When people tried to discuss the presidency with him, he made clear that he didn't want the job at all. Only because so many men convinced him that it was his duty and no one else would do did he even accept taking the office. I really don't think that this was false modesty either. Washington was proud of his reputation for winning the war and stepping away from power at the end of that war. Accepting the presidency put all that at risk. Further, Washington really wanted to focus on his plantations. He had been losing lots of money both during and after the war. Mount Vernon and his other plantations suffered from regular crop failures and other setbacks. He was deeply in debt and wanted to focus on getting his finances back in order, not running off for more government service. Regardless of whatever his true motives were, Washington's precedent of reluctance to office very quickly became a tradition. Presidential candidates for office really did not campaign at all for the next century. At best, they might respond to a letter about how they felt about some important political issue, and then see that letter getting leaked to the public. Generally, though, they relied on supporters to campaign on their behalf, while the candidate personally remained aloof. In 1866, President Andrew Johnson actively campaigned in the midterm elections, not for himself, but for congressional candidates. His actions of actively campaigning were so shocking at the time that his active campaigning became one of the articles of impeachment that Congress brought against him the following year. Beginning in the 1890s, some candidates began engaging in what were called front porch campaigns, where they simply spoke to people from the front porch of their house, and reporters happened to be there. This allowed them to talk to the people through the press, but still did not actively involve themselves in elections. They just kind of talked about what they thought about the country and what policies should be put in place. President Franklin Roosevelt was the first nominee to attend a convention that nominated him, and President Harry Truman was the first candidate that really traveled around the country in what was called a whistle-stop tour to speak directly to the people. By that time, though, presidential candidates were pretty much campaigning through newspapers and radio. But again, we're talking about well more than 100 years after Washington's campaigns. So while many of Washington's precedents as president eventually fell by the wayside, his actions as the first president did have a huge impact that did last for generations. My book recommendation this week is called The Quartet, Orchestrating the Second American Revolution by Joseph Ellis. This is a look at the effort to create and implement the Constitution, primarily focusing on the efforts of four men: George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. I've previously recommended other books by this author, Joseph Ellis. He's written a great deal about this era, and I think his books give great insight while being pretty easy to read. Unfortunately, like all books from this era, it doesn't give much attention to the election itself, and more moves from the Constitutional Convention into Washington's presidency. But it does do a good job about what it does discuss. If that sounds interesting to you, get a copy of The Quartet, Orchestrating the Second American Revolution by Joseph Ellis. My online recommendation is a site that lists the Electoral College results for 1789. It lists each of the electors by name and who they voted for, so it's a great place if you want to really look into the details of the Electoral College vote in 1789. The site is hosted at Tufts University. There are other sites that provide information about the Electoral College results, but this seems to be one of the most detailed. My question this week asks, how did Horatio Gates know that Burgoyne intended to march south to Albany instead of east into New England? Well, this question, of course, references the British offensive from Quebec into New York in 1777, which eventually resulted in the British surrender at Saratoga. Britain had effectively given up on New England following the British evacuation of Boston in March 1776. Officials recognized that there were too many active patriots there to suppress the rebellion directly, and instead they focused on cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies by creating a line between British-occupied Quebec and British-occupied New York City. So when General Burgoyne brought his army out of Quebec and moved into New York, first capturing Fort Ticonderoga, everyone knew his eventual goal was to link up with New York City. In the event that anyone did think differently, the Americans captured several Loyalist couriers who confirmed this strategy. By the time Burgoyne had committed his army to the western side of the Hudson River on his march to Albany, there really wasn't even any good way for him to get his army back across the river and head east to New England. Even if they tried, they would have had to march through hundreds of miles of wilderness, only to get to an even more hostile area with more armed enemy militia than they faced in New York. The only British outpost in New England by this time was on an island in Rhode Island, where the British could use the Navy to defend themselves and were still reasonably close to the main British force at New York City. But Rhode Island was more than 150 miles away across mostly wilderness with no water passage, as opposed to Albany, which was just 20 miles south down the river. At that point, the British Army hoped it could link up with the British from New York City, which could easily move north up the Hudson River. By the time General Gates took command of the Continental Army in August 1777, Burgoyne had already committed himself to reaching New York City. Moving in any other direction, even retreating back to Fort Ticonderoga, would have put his army at even greater risk. Gates realized that he had to keep Burgoyne from advancing south and connecting with the army in New York City because there just was no other realistic path for the British. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me, either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.